others that deal with themes without it necessarily being as systematic?
Yes, that's a very good question. The literature is growing. The literature is growing. If you've never read anything in the area, it's worth reading an older book by Edmund P. Clowney called God's Unfolding Mystery. It's out of print, but still often available on Amazon.com from secondhand bookstores and the like. God's Unfolding Mystery by Edmund P. Clowney, C-L-O-W-N-E-Y. That's still worth reading. There are 2 or 3 books written by an Australian scholar at Moore College. I bet some of you have read them. Name? Goldsworthy. Goldsworthy. And Graham Goldsworthy. Graham spelt in the British, an Australian way, G-R-A-E-M-E, Graham Goldsworthy. And he's written several. They're not all of a piece. He's fixated on certain themes like kingdom that he follows particularly strongly. But if you want to see how some of that stuff works out, that's a good place to start. There's a book edited by Desi Alexander, T.D. Alexander, who's from Northern Ireland, and 3 others of whom I'm one, Truth in Advertising, called, I think the title is New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. No, New International Dictionary of Biblical Theology. New International Dictionary of Biblical Theology by T.D. Alexander et al. And it's essentially divided into 2 parts. One part tries to trace a lot of biblical themes through Scripture, and the other part tries to give you a kind of biblical theology of each of the biblical books and corpora. And so that's a pretty good, useful resort to find out some of these things. The book that I wrote called The God Who Is There tries to go through the whole Bible in 14 chapters. And it's written at sort of university students and up. It's written at that level, but for the complete biblical illiterate. So that we've used it evangelistically in the right kind of group. And it starts assuming nothing. It explains big numbers and little numbers on the page, for example, because they don't know about chapters and verses. And because it starts off presupposing nothing, the book has gone into Chinese and other languages where it can be used evangelistically. There's a study guide that goes with that as well, if people want to get both. That's doing evangelism out of biblical theology. So, yeah, there are more and more such things around. Do others of you have favorite books along these lines? Thomas Schreiner's New Testament theology. There are a lot of New Testament theologies around that are doing biblical theology in the first sort. That is where you're looking at particular books and particular, what's the theology of John, what's the theology of Luke, Acts, what's the theology of Paul, what's the theology, you see? There are a lot of those around, many, many, many. Tom Schreiner's is one of the most recent and most useful. But that doesn't mean that Tom Schreiner is doing the big themes running right through Scripture. That's just not. He's focusing on the first kind of biblical theology that I mentioned. But there are more of those books around than any of the other kinds of biblical theology. Any other question?
David Gooding's book, The Riches of Divine Wisdom.
Yes, that's another book that's well worth, another Irishman. The Riches... An Englishman living in Ireland. I've met him many times and I didn't know that. I always thought that he was Irish. I could tell you some interesting things about David. When he was doing his PhD, this is a long time ago, he's a pretty old man now. When he was doing his PhD in Ireland, he was doing it on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so he knew Hebrew and Greek really, really well. But he still hadn't yet brushed up on his German and other contemporary languages that you need in order to interact with the literature. But he wanted to interact with a well-known German scholar who had written a lot of stuff on the Septuagint. And yet his German wasn't good enough to write to him, and he was ashamed to write in English, so he wrote to him in their common language, Latin. That's David Gooding. Big pardon? Oh yeah. He's a great guy. And for years and years and years, he would spend his teaching life working in university, and then his summers doing evangelism in Spain, and then in more recent years in Russia. And his book, The Riches of Divine Wisdom, is certainly well worth perusing. He's got a creative twist to his brain. There's some things you'll see in David Gooding that you won't find just about anywhere else. He's got a creative twist that is genuinely, he's not trying to be clever. By creative twist, I don't mean he's a smart aleck or a show-off, just the opposite. He's a humble sort of guy, but he thinks creatively about Scripture all the time in ways where you read that and you think, whoa, got to think about that, you know? And it's nice to read writers of that sort. That's a good choice. All right. Number 5. I'm going to end with this one. Number 4. I skipped over number 4. I'll just mention it and then I'll get by. Respect the different genres in John. That is, they're all Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the Synoptic Gospels have parables, for example. Narrative parables. John has no narrative parable. For example, the vineyard or the shepherd are not so much, there's no narrative to the parable. It's sort of observations on viticulture. They're extended metaphors rather than narrative parables. So there are different, and yet you have to distinguish between the narrative flow of chapters 1 to 13 and the discourse structure of chapters 14 to 16 and the prayer structure of chapter 15, and then back to narrative flow for the Passion narrative. Do you see? And those different kinds of structures within the Gospel of John demand slightly different treatments and so on. Where you have narrative structures, you've got to make sure that the entire narrative gets across. You can't focus down so narrowly that you lose the narrative. Okay, that's quickie. That's number 4. Number 5. As in all the Gospels, remember the cross and the resurrection. Now, that seems so obvious it doesn't even need to be said. But today, it does need to be said. In the last few years, there have been books with the title, The Teaching of Jesus, for example. That's an old title used by A.B. Bruce a century ago and by others. And what these books usually do is begin by saying something like, Scott McKnight's come out with one, for example, is begin by saying something like, in this book, I'm not going to focus on the cross and resurrection of Jesus. I insist on the cross and resurrection of Jesus. But I'm just going to focus on what Jesus teaches. I'm going to focus on the teaching of Jesus. And then other books can talk about Jesus' death and resurrection. Other books are commentaries that work on the whole narrative of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But in this book, I'm simply going to focus on the teaching of Jesus. And they might even say the teaching of Jesus in the Synoptics and exclude all of John, too. Or sometimes focus on the teaching of Jesus in John and exclude the Passion narrative. So there are books on all of these subjects. And I want to say, in the strongest possible terms, that you simply cannot, absolutely cannot do that sort of thing responsibly. You simply cannot. Because there is far more in the teaching of Jesus than many people recognize that anticipates the cross and resurrection. Do you see? So consider the passage in Matthew 11 that we looked at right at the beginning. Consider that passage. There's no mention of the cross and the resurrection. But the very fact that John the Baptist doesn't, at that point, have a category for a Jesus who suffers and dies, but rather wants a Messiah who is coming in as conquering king and burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire, is bound up with the fact that he lives on the other side of the cross and the resurrection. Don't you see? There's a sense in which Peter makes the same mistake in Matthew chapter 16, isn't it? From this point on, after Peter has confessed Jesus as Messiah, Jesus talks about his impending death and how people will crucify him and how he must go to Jerusalem and be spit upon and mocked and then crucified and the third day rise again. Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Get behind me, Satan, you do not understand the things of God. Well, how can you teach that as part of the teaching of Jesus without looping it into the cross and the resurrection? Do you see? And that's the way a great deal of the teaching of Jesus is throughout all of the Gospels. So that If you're in John 3 and the new birth, regeneration, there's Jesus throwing in one verse about being lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness, which becomes a code word for him for being lifted up on the cross. And chapter 4 on worship, believe me, woman, that the hour comes and now is when true worshipers will worship the Father neither here nor in Jerusalem. But what is the change that brings that about? It's not just geography. You see, it's because the temple has been bypassed by the cross and the resurrection, which is made clear in the way the Passion narrative is worked out in the gospel itself. Do you see? And chapter 5, where Jesus is the Son of God. But he's the Son of God who displays his sonship by utter obedience. There is perfect obedience that takes him to the cross, which is why in all of the Gospels that obedience is stressed. In the Synoptic Gospels, for example, Jesus in Gethsemane does not say, oh, Father, let me go to the cross, let me go to the cross. I love those sinners so much, please let me go. I'm not denying that he does love us, but that's not the final motive for him going to the cross. It's not my will, but yours be done. He goes to the cross because he's obeying his Father. He's committed to doing the Father's will. And thus the obedience of the Son theme is an anticipation of the going to the cross theme, because that was the most testing part of obeying the Father's will. If it be possible, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you. In other words, whatever you do in all of the Gospels, not least in the Gospel of John, you have to read whatever you're doing in the light of the whole. And that means in the light of the cross and the resurrection. It's worth reflecting on the fact that in the first century, no one spoke of the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of John. No one. Not as far as our records go. No one. They spoke of the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Luke, the Gospel according to John. You see, it was one Gospel. The Gospel according to... The word Gospel had not yet been transferred to the book. That happens in the 2nd century. Then you can start speaking in the 2nd century of the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John and start asking, what do those individual Gospels contribute? Okay, it's a legitimate way of talking. But in the 1st century, nobody talks like that. It's the Gospel. There's only one Gospel. The Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And that's why you see when people today come across and say, yeah, of course, but there were other Gospels too that people squeezed out. You know, when Orthodoxy got big and bold and rough, then they squeezed out things like the Gospel of Thomas. Why shouldn't the Gospel of Thomas be included? We all have access to it. You can go and download the Gospel of Thomas on the internet. So why don't we have the Gospel of Thomas? Well, the first response to that, besides many questions of canon and who was recognized when and that sort of thing, is that the document that we call the Gospel of Thomas has nothing of the Passion and Resurrection in it. It's a, quote, gospel, unquote, of 114 sayings. That's it. Plus 2 tiny little narratival snippets. So by 1st century standards of what the gospel is, it's not the gospel. You see, the gospel, by the definition provided by the 4 canonical gospels, it concerns the origins, the nature, the messiahship of Jesus, culminating in his death and resurrection to gather his people to himself by the will of God. That's what the gospel is. So you have the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel. Thomas doesn't provide us with a gospel. It's a so-called gospel of sayings. So that's one of the evidences, in fact, that it must be a 2nd century document. In my view, a pretty late 2nd century document, although some dated a little earlier in the 2nd century. There's no way it's a 1st century document because nobody talked of the gospel in those terms. Do you see? It's not the gospel of Jesus Christ according to Thomas at all. It's distorted. Now, because of that, then you must constantly, when you're preaching from any part of John's gospel, do what you must do when you're preaching from any part of any of the canonical gospels. Keep asking yourself, what is this saying in the light of the whole? And especially, how is it beckoning us onward to the cross and the resurrection of Jesus? Any questions about that?
Because of the way that in the 1st century we talked about the gospel as a singular item, should we then strongly reference the parallel passages where we have them, or should we try to take it just as John put it forward, or just as Luke put it forward?
That's a fair question, but in my view, even while it's the gospel, according to John or Mark or whatever, nevertheless, those books did circulate separately. So by the end of the 2nd century, you already have Tatian making a harmony of the 4 Gospels. So there is a place for working at harmonies and so on. But in the perfect wisdom of God, what he gave us, as he gave us a book with many different literary genres, what he gave us was one gospel according to 4 different witnesses. And there is something to be preserved about that that's precious. So I would argue that although there's a place on occasion in preaching through John to allude to what's going on in some other passage, if your whole point in your sermon at some juncture or other is established by alluding to another gospel, and you can't find the point in John, you're making a mistake. You're not listening to John on its own terms. What you're preaching, no doubt, is the truth. And if you insist on doing it, then at least say, of course, this point isn't from John. I've got this from Luke 23. But that means that you're not doing exposition in the sense that you're expounding a contiguous part of Scripture and so on. You're now beginning to flip to topical sermon. There's a place for that, but it's not the way you're going to expose people to the structure of John's thought. Yes.
Sorry, can I just ask about, you mentioned the Gospel of Thomas. What about the other apocryphal Gospels and New Testament writings? How would you summarize why they were non-canonical and why they don't have?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Virtually all of them are 2nd or 3rd century, right off the cuff. None of them had the widespread standing throughout the church that the canonical Gospels had. And that's important as well. I do strongly suggest, if you're either troubled by them or interested in them, to actually read them. And then you will discover they're in another universe. They're thinking in very different categories. Most of them are tied to some form of proto-Gnostic heresy. They really read strangely to anybody who's steeped in the canon. And then beyond that, it's also important to remember the rather interesting work on canon by Michael Kruger, Kruger. He's connected with RTS. Pardon? He studied here. Yes, he did. He did his PhD here. And Michael Kruger, besides, he's not dismissing the kind of historical stuff that you regularly do, read the patristics to find out what was adopted by what. But he's pointing out that if you have any sort of decent doctrine of Scripture based on all kinds of things, then it's not that the church